Hello, everyone. Good morning still. I will quickly introduce us. So my name is Vera Rimmer. I'm a research expert at KU Leuven research group DistriNet. This is my colleague, Professor Lieven Desmet. We both work in the intersection of AI cybersecurity with a team of over 10 very motivated people who are trying to make sense of this rather challenging and exciting area. And today, we will take you on a journey where we will try to look at all the different aspects of this intersection. So while you've been hearing in the last year and a half, maybe more, that AI is yet again revolutionizing different areas and different parts of our digital society, including cybersecurity, you might have had an impression that this was rather unexpected, a game-changing effect of AI. And in many ways, that is the case. Even the experts on AI, so the researchers and the engineers who worked on it for many decades, have not anticipated such a massive impact of this technology and trying to make sense out of this interaction. At the same time, this is not coming completely out of nowhere. In fact, AI and cybersecurity as an intersection has enjoyed more than 30 years of dedicated exploration. Granted, it started more as a niche topic. So AI has been seen as a useful tool for some tasks, specifically within cybersecurity, for some defensive tasks, where it helped us overcome rigidity and lack of flexibility of rule-based defenses. So different defenses, let's say network security, system security, fraud detection. In all of these areas, we've relied on concrete signatures in order to catch malicious behaviors. AI introduced generalizational capabilities. Even though this has been still done with close human oversight in many of those cases, it has still been, in a way, already a game changer. Then we moved on to the next era of AI, which has started with deep learning perforating the field. We moved towards new algorithms, better algorithms, stronger computational capabilities, where some sub-areas of cybersecurity have indeed been amplified and enhanced with this technology. At the same time, while this automated pattern recognition has put us even forward and allowed the defenders to not slack way too much away from the attackers, these are still very task-specific AI solutions. They've been tailored to specific cases in cybersecurity with concrete inputs and outputs, and still relied on some level of human oversight and control over these pipelines. So in these two eras, until a few years ago, AI has been there. AI's benefits have been recognized and harvested at times, but at the same time, AI has not yet dominated this domain. Now we are entering the current stage. I call it here a destabilization stage of AI in cybersecurity, because AI in many ways have disrupted the ecosystem of cybersecurity, both in research and in practice, where probably the main aspect that has allowed that to happen as soon as large language models have appeared is that instead of automating prediction for concrete tasks, we now automate the full chain of expert reasoning and expert analysis. So human capabilities and human decision-making is now can be much more AI reliant. At the same time, this is now working at both sides of the arms race, defenses and attacks, and it is quite hard to tell what is then the effect of AI. Is it a positive effect or is it a negative effect? So it is hard now to say what will happen next. We are now very closely looking at this intersection, and we are going to try together with you today make some sense of it. So what is so destabilizing or disruptive about the current stage? We've seen AI being used for cybersecurity. We've seen large language models enter the field. And now, of course, the agentic systems, the multi-agentic systems are even taking it to the new level. So these are unprecedented capabilities. The arms race is enhanced and accelerated on both sides. Of course, as usual, attackers have more advantages than defenders, because attackers only need to succeed once, while defenders need to be at the top of their game at all times. And the complexity and the lack of transparency are only growing. So the question we are asking today, what is then the impact of AI on cybersecurity, and how can we take an action to keep this under our control as both academia and industry. So in what follows, we will look at this intersection in different aspects to answer that question.
Thank you, Vera. So indeed, there's a very broad domain, and for the talk of today, we want to structure it a little bit. And I'm actually lending a kind of visual distinction between the different parts of the domain from a report of TNO from 1.5 years ago. And in that report, they're trying to see what is already happening both in academia and industry in the field between cybersecurity and AI. When looking at that, we see 4 quadrants, and we actually can read the report in 2 ways. One way is to look at it, the upper half is from the attacker side. How do attackers actually use LLM tools? How they're actually also leveraging on LLM? And the second part is how does it change the landscape for defenders? But you can also look at it a different way, and looking at the left-hand side, seeing, well, AI is a tool. Is a tool in cybersecurity, both for attackers and defenders. And on the right-hand side, you see, well, the ML-based systems, actually, there's a new component in the attack surface, being the LLM, being the AI system. And that's actually the approach that we will take today in our talk. I will talk on the left-hand side how we can use LLMs as a tool, because I will specifically only talk about LLMs because otherwise it would be too broad. On the right-hand side, Vera will talk about what is the impact on security of such an ML-based system. Start from the foundation, but also leverage towards LLMs. But so I will start on the left-hand side. And so earlier this year, I went to the RSAC conference like many, many others. And if you look there, you have a kind of an immense show floor. About 1,000 companies are there exposing their services, their products. And when looking into that, it's every year overwhelming. But this year and also last year, what we see is like you go out and you think that security is all about this. You have agents talking to other agents, fighting other agents. That's the security landscape. Take any kind of security control that you want to have, there will be a vendor now saying, well, we have an agentic solution for that. The same holds for the attackers. They're also using more and more LLMs. And this is the kind of picture that you get at that moment. And in the talk of today, I would like to be a little bit more nuanced to see what can we exactly do with these LLMs, both on the attacker side as well as on the defender side. And I will start with the attacker side, because that's also there where we hear most of the stories, for instance, on Mythos and other things. If you're looking how attackers can leverage LLMs, then the first thing that we already have been exposed in the last 1-2 years is the quality of social engineering attacks, the phishing mails. I think everyone already agrees that they're becoming better and better. And so this is the first kind of subdomain I would like to walk into, namely the social engineering at scale. If you're looking to social engineering attacks or scams in general, they're typically going through different phases in the attack flow. And here, I would like to already show how AI is driving that attack flow. Typically, when a scam starts, what an attacker will do is trying to do some reconnaissance to know what is the target, the victim I would like to target. And based on that information, craft content that will try to lure the victim into accepting or doing something on behalf of the attacker. And what we already see in the content creation, a lot of LLMs, a lot of AI techniques are being used. Whereas in the past, it was very easy to recognize a scam from a Nigerian prince. Nowadays, the text, the context around it is getting better and better and more convincing. It's really trustworthy the moment you get such a mail or any message. So AI is definitely driving there. Once that happens, then we go to the delivery phase. You get it into your mailbox, into your social messaging. You actually get the kind of trick to get interacting with the attacker. And then typically in exploitation, more and more, this exploitation phase becomes interactive. You might go into a chat, you might be in a voice call where you're actually interacting with the attacker until they get their money. They're getting the monetization of their attack. And where we're already seeing the AI content generation is definitely a place where AI plays a role. More and more we see AI also playing a role in the reconnaissance, scraping automatically LinkedIn profiles, targeting exactly that profile, and adapting the way we see the victim being addressed. The tone of the mail, the context of the mail, everything there is really, really leveraging upon that reconnaissance. And the same holds for the exploitation. Also the interaction with the attacker. Nowadays, more and more, they're using automated chatbots to interact with the victim. They're using deepfakes to actually generate that kind of trustworthy environment to really convince the victim to transfer some money. And it works in practice. So in practice, if you're looking, for instance, to one of the scams of 2024, it's the Arab scam. One of the employees was tricked in actually transferring $25 million US dollar to local accounts of the attacker. And how did they do that? First, they started with spear phishing, something that we already know for quite a while. But then they invited the victim into a video conference with colleagues. And it was generated voice by AI, and they're using deepfakes, so the victim was really thinking that he had a conversation with his colleagues. And was really convinced that he needed to transfer the money. So you see that is a complete different scale of trustworthiness compared to what we had 5 years ago. Another thing that we see popping up in the same space is deepfake job candidates. This has been an issue, especially in the US, where, in this case, people from North Korea were applying to remote IT jobs in US companies. They were also using AI technology to create the fake environmental profiles, LinkedIn profiles, but also voice and video deepfakes in order to convince during the interviews that they need to be hired. And we saw several people being hired multiple times. So people had like 10, 20 jobs in the US. They were transferring their salary outside the US, but they also were getting insights into the company. They were like a persistent insider threat. And again, this is at a complete different scale and impact that such an attack can happen. But of course, it's not only on social engineering. If you pivot to a complete different domain, with the whole context of XBO and Mythos, we see that there's also much more on automated attacks on code and systems. And it actually got more and more of the attention both of researchers and industry last year around this time in June, when XBO was presenting their automated AI-based penetration testing system. And it was actually capable at Black Hat last year to really attack systems, find vulnerabilities that were not found before, compared to earlier kind of academic papers where we were trying to redo a capture the flag or something else. At the same moment, they also were using that on commercial bug bounty platforms like HackerOne, and they even got to the #1 on the leaderboard of HackerOne back in December last year, showing that it was not only in a kind of a lab session, but a lab environment, but really worked out in practice when real companies were in production. Earlier this year, we were actually taking the next step, where we saw already vulnerabilities being detected, being exploited at a kind of small scale with XBO and others. We now have Mythos. And of course, it's still a little kind of a mystery because we don't have direct access to Mythos, so we need to base ourselves on reports that we get. But we see, for instance, in this article that Mythos detected 23,000 potential vulnerabilities in a lot of open source projects. And with Mythos, it's not only the vulnerability detection, but also the exploit generation that is getting into a different scale. And it's not limited to Mythos. We see the same things happening with OpenAI models or others as well. And so just to give you kind of a flavor of what they can do, how complex or sophisticated the exploits are, is one example that Mythos of the preview was making public was a browser exploit. A browser exploit that started off with heap spraying the just-in-time compilation of JavaScript to break out of the rendering engine and the sandbox. Then they did local privilege escalation and bypassed the address randomization in the kernel. And then the next step, they even pivoted over the network to attack an NFS server on the network of FreeBSD, and did actually return-oriented programming to do that with multiple gadgets and multiple packets. And I've already mentioned that, this is already much more complex than what you typically would expect from a system to do. This is really chaining different types of attacks together to actually do an end-to-end attack and really pivoting from one system to another. So what we see is it's how happening with Mythos at an unprecedented scale. It is actually happening very fast. But what worries me most is actually that it's also collapsing the time to exploit. Where in the past, when we found a vulnerability, it could take like up to 30 days, 60 days before an exploit was generated and then started to appear in the wild. Nowadays, it is really reducing to hours or even shorter. So the moment an exploit is and a vulnerability is out, you actually have to assume that the exploit is there as well. And this is, of course, changing the landscape. Do we need to be worried? I think at this moment, we don't have enough facts and data as a researcher to say whether to be worried or not. I think on the commercial side, Anthropic is really pushing and saying how dangerous the models are. On the other hand, we see also, I would say, incident responses saying, well, maybe it's not going that fast. And I think it's somewhere probably in between. So here, this is a report of FIRST, and they were actually trying to measure how much CVEs were being reported this year in the first 4 months. And what they saw that the reports were, of course, coming quicker than they anticipated. About 50% more of the reports came in, and they're actually prolonging that as a kind of expectation for the rest of the year as well. But more important, what they try to measure, how many of these vulnerabilities are already exploited in the wild or can be exploited within a 30-day window. And they made an estimate of that. And there it seemed that it was rather quite stable. It didn't change so much. So while there are a lot of vulnerabilities, the ones that get exploited or exploited in a short term seems to be kind of on par at this moment. But of course, this could change quite rapidly. I think this is still data from before the Mythos kind of saga of all the vulnerabilities that were reported then. But again, I think we always need to be a little bit kind of nuanced with the messaging in the media. Also important to take into account is what changed really with Mythos is the way we think about an attack. If you're looking to the MITRE attack framework here, the TTPs, I would say like 1 year ago, if you would let me do the same presentation, I would say those models are very good just to get initial access to a system, great. They can find CVs very quickly. They can even go outside that and find new vulnerabilities, for instance, on a web system, for instance, on HackerOne, based on what we saw already with XBOW. In practice, we need to be honest and say, well, they're much more capable now. They're doing full reconnaissance. They're doing the initial access. They can become persistent. They do privilege escalation, and they start to pivot. And more, we're going to an end-to-end system where really the full attack chain can be automated or assisted. Because I think in most situations, because of performance, still a human will try to drive it into being much more performant, much closer to the objective that they want to reach. So what is now the impact on the attacker landscape? I think important, the asymmetry that we already had between defenders and attackers only increased. Now they have actually they only needed to break one thing and we needed to fix everything. Now they have tools to scale up that breaking one thing at a scale that was unprecedented before. What you also see, and I think is also important, that with all this tooling, the barrier as a hacker or an attacker to do something that is actually stealing data or breaking in, the expertise that they need is really dropping down. Almost everything out of the box can come with kind of a small layer around such an LLM because the expertise is already captured within the model. And the third thing is, what we also were not expecting so fast, is that the complexity or the sophistication of the attacks is quickly increasing. Having like end-to-end chains, like I was demonstrating with the browser exploit, is something I would not have foreseen if you would ask me 1 year ago. So, but is it all negative? Again, I try to stay positive and saying, well, the same techniques that we're using to find the vulnerabilities to attack is also at our disposal as defenders. Maybe not at the same scale, the same speed, but at least the same reasoning, the same way we're dealing with that can help us as well. And so let's look a little bit more at what it can mean for the defender side. How can we leverage upon LLMs on the defender side? And I will only focus on 2 specific subdomains because we can't cover all the security domains in one presentation, but at least gives a kind of a diversity already on how they are being used. And the first one, which is rather obvious in terms of security, is how can we automate certain things in security operations. I think within a SOC, the security analysts are really suffering. Compared to a lot of the things that we have in academia, they actually have plenty of data. Unfortunately, the data is very noisy. They have a lot of false positives in that data. And what happens is that you get alert fatigue, you get burnouts of the analyst. It's really hard to actually being able to process that information. Especially with all the new vulnerabilities coming in, it's very hard to triage to see what is really applicable to my system. It's actually putting more pressure on the SOC. And there we see multiple services, multiple products arising, leveraging upon LLMs. Of course, the alert triage, where we're actually getting a lot of reports. How can we connect the dots? How can we actually make sure all the different signals that we see coming in our SIEM, what it actually means, and can we build that to a really incident narrative rather than having loose points? And there, LLMs can really help to structure that. The second one is, for every of the CVEs, we're getting threat intelligence, we're getting TTPs. But in order to get that information being processed in your own SOC, in your own environment, this flow of information is just too much. And there we see really the applicability of LLMs to being able to process those reports and making them actionable for the SOC itself. And they can leverage upon cyber-specific LLMs. And third, they can also help to think about prioritizing the vulnerability management and patching. Because we're having a lot of CVs, we're having a lot of new vulnerabilities being discovered, we will need to prioritize how we will actually patch our system based on risks, especially with all the new regulations coming up. So I think for the SOC, it's already in place. You see already different products coming in, not all at the same maturity, but this is definitely there to stay. What about another domain? So let's pivot, for instance, to software engineering. When we're building software, we actually want to have a kind of secure software development lifecycle. People that are aware of software building will immediately recognize OWASP SAM. SAM is a maturity model for software engineering, where you have different activities on security being implemented as part of your life cycle. They're grouped in 5 different keywords like design, implementation, verification. And I tried to map how many of them would actually be very suitable for using AI technology, LLM technology to accelerate. Probably in a lot of cases as an assistant, not as an automatic system, but as an assistant to the software developer. And so the ones that are very dark on the picture are all the ones where actually obvious cases how to apply LLMs. And the other ones, it's still a little bit in doubt to what extent LLMs might make a difference. But you see really in many areas that the LLMs can bring additional value to the software engineer, to the security engineer in the software engineering process. Again, I don't have the time to go in detail of any of on all of the topics, so let's just pick one. One that I think is very promising. I think the one that is most promising at this moment is the AI-based threat modeling. Threat modeling becomes more and more important, especially if we need to do kind of risk assessments due to different degradations. But I think it's also a very good one to start to see how GenAI technology can be embedded in your team. But there are different ways how to use that. I think the first pragmatic way to use it is just using the LLM as an assistant. You're asking the LLM a few things. You might think about a ChatGPT-like style where you're actually interacting with the LLM to ask a few questions about your system, maybe giving some information about the system diagrams, the DFDs. But you're the driver as a human, but you want expertise from the model. But then you're really doing the threat modeling by the humans. You're just helping them to actually accelerate a little bit faster. You could also pivot to LLM as a guide, where you say really the LLM is driving the whole process. If you, for instance, say the threat modeling with AI, if you're really saying, well, it's a facilitator, you might even think in very immature teams on security that this one is actually helping to raise the awareness, to let's discuss security items based from a way of interacting with the LLM. And then the LLM is really the driver, whereas in the first case, it was the human driving the LLM. Here is the LLM driving the human. That's one way to do it. You could also thinking about that the LLM is an interviewer, where you already did your assessment, and the interviewing is challenging you on some of the discussions. And the third one, which is, I would say, not yet in production being used, but this is kind of the future where we want to go, is where the LLM is really on itself an analyst, much more integrated into the code base itself, and it's more continuously doing threat modeling based on your code base, and then leveraging alerting to a human or to a team whenever certain decisions need to be made. But there, really, the whole kind of process is continuous. That's something that we're already dreaming of for a very long time in the domain of threat modeling. But here, the LLM can really help in making that structure, understanding the code base. Yes?
I have a question about this because in my experience, right now, LLMs are insufficiently mature. We don't know in very many cases what they have been trained on, what their expertise is. So if you don't have RAGs or other systems that sort of have the expertise from which the LLM draws its conclusions. In this situation, it is very dangerous to use an LLM in any of these functions if you're not an expert yourself already.
I would disagree. So the opinion is from the hypothesis, because we don't know what is being trained on, it actually might negatively influence. I think you're right in that sense, but the same holds for instance, an experienced group of developers that want to do threat modeling. They will also go and look up information on the net. They might have the same kind of incompletenesses, because here it's not you automatically generate code. What you do is interacting with a human to ask whether or not the control needs to be added.
That's not what I mean. So what I mean is that there is a tendency, and so I'm not talking about the coders themselves, but about management, to think that now is the time to replace their very expensive experts with juniors aided by LLMs.
Yeah.
And I think personally that it's not ready for that, because the juniors who are inexperienced, they cannot see when the LLM is producing something that is absolute nonsense.
That's not my stance to say, well, we need to drop the experts. I'm just saying the experts can scale better, can do their work better if they're assisted. And that's what I'm looking at in this presentation. But I think there's a complete different kind of context that we can discuss for hours. So I would like to take that offline.
Message for the managers, right?
Yeah.
So in the second part of the presentation, we will look more into the drawbacks and into the possible pitfalls. So we will definitely touch on this.
So I think what's more from a technical point of view, and then I will have to hand over to Vera to see the other part of the talk as well. What are some of the key challenges that we currently have in this technology? Just if you say, well, we really trust in the experts that are working in the team, but they want to work on this technology. Input quality. I think what we have been suffering in the past doesn't change. If you don't have good architectural descriptions, if your DFDs or any other information that you use on input is not accurately linked to your code, if you put in rubbish, you will get out rubbish as well. Another thing that is currently a little bit missing, we can integrate well with the code, so we're getting better and better integration with the code, as long as your token budget is not exceeded, of course. But what we have is we might miss the kind of business context around it. So we might see the application, but not necessarily kind of a business context, how to interpret that application. And that's something that is sometimes hard to add to this kind of technology. And also important, maturity of the team. So if you have a very experienced team, you will work with this technology completely different than an inexperienced team that wants to build up maturity. And this can help to build up maturity. It will not replace the expert need, but it will at least help them to see that what are the kind of questions that we at least need to start to build up that maturity. And with that, I hope I give you kind of a first kind of heads up on how the LM landscape, where you're actually using LM as a tool, really changed attacker and defender. I think the asymmetry is still existing, maybe a little bit growing, but I think also on the defender side, we see a lot of positive news as well. So Vera.
Thank you.
Yes?
In the very beginning of the presentation, you showed the slide, you showed the statistics about number of critical vulnerability and number of non-exploitable vulnerability that has been identified. I think the data, if I remember well, was from 2026. When we look at the data and compare the trend between 2025 to 2024 and before, there is a huge rise. So non-exploitable vulnerability has increased by over 42%, and high critical vulnerabilities by over 80%. I understand why you are looking at 2026, but and I work in this
Yeah.
as well, but at least when we are looking at it, we do consider that even though AI now equals, as you mentioned, everyone feels like this is revolutionizing the whole cybersecurity, but nevertheless the trend already started a year before. So I would say it's good that now we are looking also at how to utilize AI to defend ourselves in the defense security, but nevertheless the race already started. Also when we look at the time to remediate vulnerabilities, previously in 2025 we were talking about 7 days, and that was also, I would say, industry standard, but now we are talking about, at least Microsoft claims to be less than 30 minutes.
Yep.
And then there are some other companies who are claiming to be less than 15 minutes. So I think those are the aspects that, again, I don't look at it in 2026, how it's starting to change our landscape, but we should definitely look at least for us, it's, and when I say us, I mean the financial sector, the time already started in early 2025, that's where we see the big changes.
No, I fully agree. I just want to give the kind of nuanced view that it's not exponentially rising at this moment necessarily. What Mythos actually tries to kind of convey. I think we see, of course, that growing number of vulnerabilities that are being reported and is exploitable especially because they automatically generate exploits almost immediately. If you now say a vulnerability report comes out, you have the exploit. That's kind of the assumption I would make.
Thank you. So as Lieven already nicely set out, we wanted to start with acknowledging possible opportunities and some benefits that maybe can favor not only the attackers, which already got their hands onto this technology, but the defenders as well. At the same time, we very much promote a healthy level of skepticism, because only with principled understanding of these technologies and being aware of what can go wrong, you can deploy it thoughtfully and responsibly going forward. So in order to tap into that discussion, we will give an overview of AI vulnerabilities, because AI by itself is a core component that needs to be threat modeled, that needs to be understood, how it behaves, whether it's tasked with defensive capabilities or something else, how it behaves in inherently adversarial environments. So the main takeaway here on the security aspect of AI is that it's by itself an inherently insecure technology. It was never meant to resist strategic manipulations or influences which try to disrupt its working. So the first thing that was already clear when the initial research on vulnerabilities of AI has begun is that involving AI at the core of any system already by default increases its threat landscape. Whether AI is at the core of that system and tasked with the main functionality, or if it's an external component that is being queried through API access or anything else, if there is any sensitive data at play, or there is a critical infrastructure where this is being deployed, or any other, let's say, operation that can be open to the external world, AI itself needs to be analyzed as a potentially vulnerable component. And not only vulnerable, but also unpredictable. And we will try to cover both of these aspects. So, roughly speaking, I would like to put AI vulnerabilities into 3 categories. You will find very different resources on what is considered potentially insecure or unsafe about machine learning models, deep learning models, generative models, including large language models, and so on. But roughly speaking, there are 3 major categories. And before I introduce them, I would like to quickly check with the audience. Could you please raise your hand if you actively work with AI or research AI? Okay, it's almost the whole room. So this will be a little bit of preaching to the choir, so bear with me. So in the first category, as probably you know also from your work and also from the media, because this is often a type of threat that is highlighted, is output manipulation. Output manipulation of AI models can have very different purposes. So this could be to trigger a misclassification, so to make the model make a wrong prediction in a variety of cases, in a variety of contexts. Specifically in cybersecurity, this often means evade detection. So you assume your AI model does a defensive function, and by manipulating its output, you evade being detected as a malicious actor. It can also be pushed to perform an unauthorized action, whatever that entails, be that in access control or something happening within agentic systems. So there are ways to perturb the inputs to the model in such a way that for a human that would not have changed the outcome, but for the AI model, it does. And this is an inherent vulnerability. We will zoom in into it a little bit later. The other category is what we call model manipulation. You might have also heard of poisoning threats. This is where you try to tamper with the model itself. You might change the weights, or you might actually change the entire model. You might install a backdoor, a Trojan inside the model where it misbehaves when it sees a specific input. This is also the span of supply chain attacks, where, especially now when so many people are using third-party models from big vendors, security of the supply chain is very important. And also in agentic systems, a lot of aspects of agents can also be tampered with, such as poisoning its memory. And the third large category is extraction of information. This is also where all kind of privacy concerns come in. If AI works with sensitive data or proprietary information, there are channels through which you can extract those. And this is definitely undesirable. And every time when AI is involved in processing confidential data, this type of threats need to be acknowledged and tested. This also includes such threats as stealing the entire model, like reconstructing the model itself or inverting the model in order to reconstruct its training data. So keeping this in mind, if these are the different vectors of vulnerability, which we already have known before the generative AI and large language models have entered the space, let's try to think, how does this transform to large language models? Large language models is arguably a more modern technology, and now it is already being included, and we've just heard the comment that there is huge business pressure to involve this technology into all important operations in organizations, be that financial sector, cybersecurity sector, social sector, governmental, and so on. So just to gauge your intuition here, if those were the threats that we already knew are possible depending on the application and the attacker's capabilities against traditional AI systems, let's say deep learning and everything before, and now we have large language models entering the space, I want to kind of see where you are in your intuition about this. Do you believe that now that LLMs are here, they are more secure and they have less such weaknesses? Do you feel that it's more or less comparable, or do you feel that LLMs have more weaknesses than traditional AI? So if there is someone who believes traditional AI has more weaknesses than LLMs, do you feel that it is more comparable, perhaps, some intersection, comparable span? And who believes that large language models have way more issues than traditional AI? Yeah, majority in the room. Fantastic. So we are now pretty much aligned on this. So what in fact happens is that large language models inherit vulnerabilities from traditional AI, and they add more on top. It doesn't mean that we are powerless in this. It's just something that needs to be understood. The fundamental issues of AI, they didn't go anywhere. They did not dissipate when LLMs entered the space. So LLMs inherit the risks, and they add novel risks, and we need to understand why that happens and what to do about it. So in the traditional AI paradigm, when we're talking about data-driven AI, we were still working with very task-specific models. They were based on control, curated data sets, maybe not with a full oversight into the internals of the data set, but there was still some demand on domain expertise in order to build working pipelines to end up with working systems. The inputs and outputs were controlled. Because the outputs were controlled, it was much easier to measure. It was much easier to understand what is the performance of the systems in my intended scenarios. And such models, they were typically treated as a separate component that could be isolated, that could be tested, included, or put out of the system. And because of this more or less controlled space, the mitigations, the set of mitigations was also clear. They were not always feasible. They were not always most effective. There are sometimes prohibitive trade-offs when you try to mitigate issues with AI, but it was still, let's say, approachable. This has changed dramatically now with large language models and generative AI models. They became general purpose. What this means is that both the inputs and the outputs became unbounded. The scenarios in which the systems can be used are, let's say, uncountable. So in that sense, you are getting the flexibility and the versatility of these systems, which also means it's quite hard to anticipate and to benchmark these systems. These are two sides of the same coin. So, and furthermore, not only are these systems much more unbounded and general purpose, they're also now being more and more closely integrated with active workflows in private sector. So the multi-agent system deployments means you cannot anymore extract the AI component and test it separately. Everything relies on it, and that makes it quite hard to scale what we knew as effective mitigations. And some of the mitigations don't even apply anymore due to the scale of these technologies and due to the fact that we are now relying on third-party assets oftentimes. Not always. There are options to avoid that, but this is just something to keep in mind. So this is the complexity that we are dealing with. I can refer you again indeed to the AWASP top 10 on generative AI threat modeling. So you've heard before AI may be a potentially useful tool for threat modeling, but AI itself also needs to be threat modeled. And there are different aspects, different risks, which academics and industry specialists and policymakers together try to evaluate to assess severity and practicality of these risks. And in what follows, I just want to give you a few examples. So because I noticed there are quite a lot of people in the room who work with AI systems, you might have heard that you must have taken this as a base assumption that AI is quite robust to noise. It's robust to random changes. At the same time, it is still vulnerable to strategic changes, the changes that are meant to undermine the model. The example here is that if you add strategically crafted noise to this driving sign, to this road sign, you might cause a misprediction by a car which uses visual perception and pattern recognition in order to drive. So this is, you would probably agree, this is a critical vulnerability. But for a long time, these threats were theoretical. More and more, and most recently, we're seeing that these threats are applicable to the physical world as well. If we have critical AI systems in the physical world which rely on visual perception, it is possible to include such perturbations which would go unnoticed by a human in order to disrupt the model. So why does this happen? This happens due to an inherent algorithmic characteristic of AI. So when we try to build our classification models, we're trying to map out all the data that we have. So I'm still talking purely about the data-driven AI paradigm. We're trying to map it into a multidimensional space and we're trying to build boundaries. These boundaries, they will be imperfect because our data representations are imperfect. Our features will be imperfect. So there will always be this gap between what we intend an AI model to do and how we're able to model it through the data and through the algorithms that we use. So eventually, these boundaries, they will have blind spots. And strategic perturbations, in order to undermine the model, they exploit those blind spots on the boundary. And I will talk a bit later about how this can be overcome, but sometimes this is really easy to do, to shift a point which semantically is still, let's say, malicious, but you can shift it just over the boundary to make it appear benign, as an example. Large language models, they go even beyond that. While they are vulnerable to strategic perturbations, and there is a lot of academic work on this, more practically, there is even a separate problem. Because large language models, they take in the data and they take in the instructions of people who use it, but they are not able to tell them apart because of the architectural characteristics of this technology. So in this example, someone is just asked to read an email, but the email, which is an external source, includes malicious instructions. This is what we call an indirect prompt injection. And then the model, instead of performing the original requested action, it will perform the malicious action, which is within the untrusted piece of information. And it is an open challenge of how to prevent these issues from happening. So as I already tried to allude to, the same properties that make LLMs as good as they are and give them those unprecedented capabilities, those are the properties that make them more opaque, less controllable, and oftentimes quite vulnerable. So if we are to benefit from the positive properties, we need to be aware of these risks. Just to briefly go also in the realm of privacy risks, so remember I mentioned the information extraction threats. We already knew that AI, especially the more powerful AI is, the more prevalently this happens, can memorize the data. And it's perhaps not a problem when you build a regular image classifier, but it is a problem when you build your AI models on sensitive information. So this is one of the first research results and some more recent ones on how an attacker can reconstruct training data with quite some precision, which can be damning depending on the application. So, and without specific measures, AI tends to memorize data. And we will look into why this is happening largely. And what is even more important, before it used to be that only very strong attackers could make this happen. But these days it is possible simply by having API access to the model and know much more extra auxiliary information, such attacks become feasible. So why does this happen? Most people here are familiar with the notion of overfitting. We try to avoid that when we train models because we want them to generalize. We don't want them to be over-specific to the data points that we provide. But so it happens that AI with much more learning capabilities, they are somehow able to do both. They are able to, once you go over a certain point, which is called interpolation point, in terms of the number of parameters in your model, which is how we reflect the model's learning capability. Once you go over that point, the model is able to generalize to unseen samples and memorize a lot of your data. So it's at the same time generalizing and overfitting to your data sets. And this is kind of a phenomenon that we already noticed a few years ago in academia. We're seeing this now more and more with bigger models. So large models memorize orders of magnitude more of data than smaller models, unless you use specific mitigations. And the tricky part is, the larger the model, the harder it is to use the known mitigations against memorization, especially because oftentimes frontier AI model vendors, they shoot for performance. And performance is, of course, better with overfitting because you obtain factual correctness. But as security and privacy specialists, factual correctness is a double-edged sword for us. There is also an extra risk because if you have retrieval augmented systems involved, if you have the databases with confidential information, which is there stored as vectors or verbatim or both, those also have a risk of being extractable. So this is roughly speaking why the problems with LLMs, they are not unexpected. So these type of weaknesses, we knew that for traditional AI, and they're now taking novel shapes in the space of generative AI and LLMs. We knew certain mitigations that worked. Some of them do not scale anymore, and we need new types of mitigations. And we will talk about mitigations a little bit later. But before we go forward, I want to take a moment and acknowledge that it's not only through adversarial influence that AI models might fail in production. There are actually other effects and other unpredictable characteristics of AI which might make it not always reliable and demands extra attention. So we will talk about semantic gaps. That's a small hint. Does anyone in the room recognize this horse? I would like to at least see one hand. Okay, I see two hands. That's double for what I was hoping for. Amazing. So this is a horse called Clever Hans. In the previous century, he was quite famous in the proximity of the village for being able to count. So he could do mathematical operations, simple mathematical operations. He would give answers to questions by stomping his hoof the correct number of times. It turned out, with some later scrutiny, that the horse could sense the moods in the audience around it and stop thumping when people were the most excited, because that's how they knew this is the right answer. And the horse would sense it and he would start stomping. What does that tell you? The horse performed brilliantly, but not for the reasons that we thought it did. So this is a so-called Clever Hans effect, and it is very natural for AI. Basically, AI falls for this type of semantic gaps just naturally, unless we guide it to do otherwise. So just in the interest of time, a very brief example. Some cases of this were already publicized during the pandemic, because AI was tasked with analyzing a lot of medical data, and they noticed that it did COVID prediction not on the basis of the lungs and the patterns in the lungs, but on the basis of doctor marks in the corner of the scans, which is, of course, really not what you want in critical applications. So the main takeaway in the semantic gap space is that modern AI will choose the path of least resistance in order to perform your task. And as I already alluded before, the way we frame our tasks cannot be perfect. We cannot perfectly model or represent the data and the problem that we have at hand. This is what we also call shortcuts. So by default, if there are shortcuts in the data that we have not anticipated, AI will find those shortcuts because that's much easier than solving the actual task. And funnily enough, again, the larger the models, the more learning capabilities they have, the harder it is to notice this behavior. So, but this is a COSIC course. We're talking about cybersecurity. Do these type of semantic gaps happen also in cybersecurity domains? And they certainly do. They happen on a very large scale. Over the last years, with our team, as well as with our collaborators, we have found that there are a lot of such issues that happen across cybersecurity domains, that happen in network traffic analysis, vulnerability discovery, and then malware detection and beyond. The issue there, to some extent, is because the data is imperfect and it might have such shortcuts, some accidental spurious correlations with the label that AI can take on itself, but also because the pipelines that we use, they're not always explainable pipelines. When we see high performance metrics, we celebrate and we might not investigate on why these high performance metrics were achieved. And oftentimes it's not for the reasons that you as a domain specialist have intended. So the other takeaway in this part is if you see a model which performs very, very well, does it mean that it understands the task the way you intended? And the default answer is no. And you need to provide more evidence why you believe it is indeed doing what you had in mind. And often one way to do that is to try to test it in more unpredictable scenarios. But of course, that's the difficulty of this problem. If the models suffer from semantic gaps, they will fail in production, and that's good news. You will notice that something is wrong, and you might fix it before the attackers exploit that. But before you deploy your model, it might be quite hard to reveal these gaps. So our LLMs, because they are trained on so much more data by very, very smart people with a lot of computational resources, are they more resilient? They're not necessarily more resilient. You've heard of hallucinations, but this is even more than that. When these times, the general purpose LLMs, they are being often specified, again, to specific cybersecurity applications. And this is a very recent observation in an academic paper just a few months ago, where they looked at how LLMs behave at vulnerability discovery. Deep learning was already used for vulnerability discovery before. It was vulnerable to such semantic gaps. It looked at syntaxes instead of the semantics of the vulnerability. So are LLMs any better because they have more information? Turned out that LLMs as well do not just by default pick up semantics. And it is even arguably harder to troubleshoot that. So this is a bit of a convoluted example, but you have here code snippets. You have to assume that inside this function there is a vulnerable code, but at the very start you just see initialization of a variable, and the variable has a very lengthy name on the left. So the question is, how can I perturb the code as an attacker such that the code still compiles, but it evades the model? You can do random perturbations and then maybe you break the functionality of the code, but you need to keep that functionality and yet be able to manipulate the model. And here on the left side is where this works. So they changed simply the name of the variable. They did not change the semantics of the code, and they were able to avoid LLM-based vulnerability discovery. So LLMs as well, they learn statistical correlations. They don't necessarily learn real semantics. At least you cannot expect that by default. So that's why we need to be very aware of when our pipelines are LLM assisted. And that's why still having the expertise in your domain is crucial. And even worse, these gaps can be exploited by attackers. If you don't fix that proactively, this is a very easy gap to exploit in many ways. Perhaps you've heard the expression that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. This is how probably we should look at LLMs as well. They are not necessarily right in the way they do what they need to do, but oftentimes this can be very useful, especially with extra scrutiny and extra mitigations. So just briefly, why are these problems persistent? This is once I sketch this out, it might feel a little obvious, but I must tell you it took quite a long time, let's say at least a decade, for the cybersecurity and AI community to perform this analysis, because there are certain mismatches in how AI is supposed to work and how AI was envisioned as a paradigm, as a technique, and what we expect from it in the cybersecurity context. This can be summarized as such. As you all know, AI is meant to learn from past experiences in order to accurately predict or generate data. But in our highly paced, dynamic domains, oftentimes past examples, they're just outdated way too quickly. So future might be vastly different, and this creates utility risks of AI in the first place, where it can fail at deployment. Secondly, AI as a paradigm, it assumes that the training data is representative and complete. It can tolerate some noise, some missing values, but oftentimes in our case, even if we have a lot of data, it might not necessarily be representative of what we are trying to solve in cybersecurity. And beyond cybersecurity, this can reinforce biases. If we are working with human data, for instance, for authentication system, we collect biometrics, behaviors, and so on. It might include biases that we have not mitigated upfront. And finally, AI, again, as a paradigm, it assumes that the data, the way it occurs in the world, it's not, it's independent from the model that you build on this data. But that's, apologies. But that's really not true when we're talking about adversarial environments. In adversarial environments, the attackers have the capabilities to change the data such that they can affect the model. And this was not part of the original envisioning of this system. So in a nutshell, AI can do very well in very intended cases on intended data, but its behavior might change in unintended contexts on unintended data, and this is not something we can always control. So because this is just a 1-hour presentation, basically a primer on AI and cybersecurity, we don't have the time to go in depth into all the possible mitigations. Our goal here is to say that AI in many ways is now forever intertwined with cybersecurity, and we can argue about in which applications it is maybe more mature or less mature, but it's already been integrated. Mostly, it is also definitely being already used by attackers. So it is not optional to use AI in cybersecurity, but AI has pitfalls. AI has drawbacks that require principled understanding and principled mitigation. So what we want from an AI system is we want it to be robust, not only high-performant. High-performant models can crumble. They can be brittle when something changes. I hope I've convinced you of that already. So when AI is performant and robust, it means it can maintain its performance when unexpected things happen or when there are malicious influences. So how do we get there? Before the LLM evolution, there was still some hope that we can maybe achieve certified or provable robustness. There was some research on this, mostly on small models or linear models. Like it was something that was being developed and the mathematical foundations were being established. We have to let go of that now because the models that we're dealing with, the large models, making them certifiably robust is out of reach. So we're looking into empirical testing and empirical defenses. So we are trying to collect all the know-how that we already had in system security and web security in order to safeguard these models. And we are looking into defense in depth. Of course, on the level of the model itself, there are still some things you can do. Just for to introduce you to the state of the art on that. If you know how to create adversarial examples, if you know how to make strategic manipulations to make your model fail, you can do that and include that in your training data. This way you will robustify your model. You will improve its decision boundary. The problem is that in some cases it's easy to do so, and in other cases it's practically really hard to do that. In code, in malware, in network traffic, these are really hard, open problems in both research and industry. And most importantly, this is not a panacea. It only works against the attack you already know. You have no idea how this will generalize to the attacks you don't know. So this is the endless arms race, cat-mouse game, as is the case for many empirical defenses in security and privacy. So when we go to LLMs, we might not be able to change the boundaries of the LLMs themselves because robustifying them is so much more costly, and we don't always have access to those pre-trained models to robustify them. So there is a plethora of things that we can do. This is why I was talking about defense in depth. We have to look at it from the different aspects. We have to use our best ideas for the architecture, software architectural level around it, things like sanitization, trying to create observability, trying to have real-time controls, but also everything on the inputs and outputs and proactive mitigations to the extent possible. Importantly, as I hope I convinced you, you need to threat model these systems and see what type of risks are possible and what type of risks you would really like to avoid. There are also AI-based guardrails. Oftentimes, they can work very well, but oftentimes they're, again, large language model-based. So you're creating an LLM protecting another LLM. This creates 2 layers of vulnerability. Also, when you try to explain your systems these days, they're also large language-based. So your explainability systems are also vulnerable. So you have several layers of dependencies there, which is quite hard to wrap your head around. That's why this is such an actively ongoing research area. And finally, the exciting part is that the same things that the attacker can do, like Lieven already mentioned, we have the same tools at our disposal. We can stress test these systems. We can try to make them fail such that we can anticipate these failures. But this is from the security and privacy standpoint. Of course, we have a whole list of mitigation areas that are being developed for the wider purpose of trustworthy AI. This includes robustness and safety and ethical considerations, fairness and privacy in their performance on human data. Each of these areas demand dedicated attention. So to conclude on this, we tried to convey today that while AI amplifies capabilities in cybersecurity, it also enlarges risks. So both sides of the arms race are affected. The defining feature of the current era is still uncertainty. Some people are very optimistic, other specialists might be more pessimistic, and at this time we're just still trying to make sense out of it and to thoughtfully benchmark these systems across applications in order to understand what will be then the role of AI in cybersecurity, what is its net effect. Importantly, the vulnerabilities in AI, in the paradigm that we know it today, data-driven AI, oftentimes based on transformers, they cannot be fixed. They can only be mitigated. And that's why it's on us as a responsibility to make the systems more trustworthy. Finally, the way to get there is through exchange between communities. These algorithms, they're already being used and they're pushed for being used. So we need more exchange between academia, industry, and law in order to properly safeguard these technologies. And to that end, I want to briefly invite you to the Summer School in Security, Privacy in the Age of AI that we run in September, if you would like to get a more in-depth lectures on these aspects. Thank you so much for your attention.